Welcome, and thank you for joining us for another study of God's Word today. We are continuing our study in the book of 1 Corinthians. If you're just joining us, we've had a couple of lessons already, and we're moving through at a rapid pace. What we're doing right now at Pepper Road is we're going through all of the epistles through the New Testament in 2 quarters, except one of those epistles that will take a whole quarter after we've gone through the rest of them. And so we'll spend a whole quarter on Romans in about 6 months from now. But we're just going through them in the order that they appear in your Bibles. And so we've been going through 1 Corinthians. We're covering 3 or 4 chapters per class, and we're beginning on chapter 8 today. And so we're glad to have you joining us and studying along with us. We have 3 of our men here from Pepper Road. Robert Mullen is with us. Matt Davis, one of our deacons, and then one of our elders, Leonard Westbrook, is here with us today. And so we're glad to have them with us and to be able to study God's Word together with you all. We've been looking at sort of one of the major themes in the book of 1 Corinthians, that is division versus unity. So many things are causing division in Corinth. And we looked at the first week that it's got to do with personal loyalties and sort of a carnal mindset. And so Paul really leans in on that in those first few chapters. Then in our last class, we looked at chapters 5 through 7, in which there's sexual immorality, and that sexual immorality interpersonally within the church, sexual immorality among members of the church and the world. And then there's the issue of marriage and marriage between Christians and non-Christians and the conflicts that arise from that. And so lots of sort of basis for conflict, and Paul is working through that with the Corinthians and showing them how Christ helps us resolve those conflicts, and especially among each other. Well, today we're looking at another aspect of conflict, and it arises particularly over a question about meat, not just any meat, but meat that is offered to idols. And so we're going to be looking through chapters 8, 9, and 10, and looking at some of the ways that Paul gives them to think about that and to make decisions on what they need to do about that. So to begin with, we open up chapter 8, and it starts by saying, concerning the things sacrificed to idols, we know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge makes arrogant, but love edifies, or knowledge puffs up, some of your translations will say. Well, as we look at that question, Robert, can you tell us how exactly knowledge can puff up, and particularly in this situation, how would that work?
Well, certainly. What I put there was that one person's knowledge, if we ourselves are very certain about something, like for example, the offering things to idols, or rather meat that's been offered to idols, we might know that an idol is just a piece of wood or stone, and so it doesn't make any difference. But and that can lead us to being puffed up or being proud and being impatient with our brothers. We can definitely have the attitude that, we don't have a problem with this, so why should they? And of course, this applies in many things, not just having to not meat sacrifice to idols. We can have this attitude about a lot of things that maybe is an area of judgment, and to us, we think it's clear that you should do something this particular way, or you should have this opinion about something, and be prideful in ourselves and inconsiderate of others, and maybe harshly critical of others who have a different opinion, when what we ought to be doing is working from, again, the objective of love, to edify our brother and encourage each other. And even if we have disagreements, to be working to help them, not be impatient or harsh with them because we're puffed up in our own pride.
Yeah, I think that one of the aspects of being puffed up here, and especially as he gets into verse 2, if anyone supposes that he knows anything, he's not yet known as he ought to know. I think one of the things Paul's fixing to do is throw a bunch of things at them that they haven't considered. They think they've got it all figured out. We understand, what's going on here. And Paul says, you have no idea. You haven't thought everything through. You've thought of one aspect of this. Here's another thing to think about, and here's another. I mean, you think about it for such a simple decision, and Paul is going to give them 3 chapters worth of things to think about to people who thought they knew. And it's not that even what they knew was wrong so much as it was incomplete. It was not the thorough thoughtfulness that they needed to put into the question. Well, along those lines then, Matt, as we're looking at the question as the argument that they might make, let's say, for eating meat offered to idols, what does that argument look like? And what is the, maybe what is the justification for that argument? If you eat meat to idols, what is actually happening there?
Well, Paul lays out the case in starting in verse 4, and he goes through about verse 8, and he says that there's no such thing as idols, or certainly while idols exist, what idols are supposed to represent, they don't exist. There's no such thing as a false god, and these Corinthians may be saying the same thing. It doesn't mean anything. There's nothing that this meat actually, what this meat is sacrificed to, it doesn't represent anything real. And even if we grant the hypothetical that there are these so-called gods, well, that doesn't affect us either, because we are dedicated truly and wholly to the one true God, and that's our God, the Father. We exist for him. We exist through Christ. But the problem is there's some men, particularly with a background of idolatry from Corinth, that were very accustomed to idolatry. And when they saw that idol and they saw the ritual associated with that idol, or the meat or food associated with that idol, it did affect their conscience. They made that connection, even though it wasn't really there in reality. They were making the connection, when in truth, God makes no distinction at all. What we eat is totally indifferent to God. So you would have those, the stronger brethren that say, this doesn't mean anything at all. And they were right in that. It didn't mean anything at all. But you would have weaker brethren that were still making that connection because of such a strong connection that idolatry had in their past.
Yeah, so what we find here is an illustration, an example of the sort of question that comes up where it's not just a question of, is this thing in and of itself sinful or not? The question of is the meat somehow spiritually tainted? No, that's really not what's going on here. And Paul sort of concedes that. Says, fair enough, you're right, you're not wrong about that. But so his case is not superstitious, we might say. And I think that's what these people would be saying is, oh, it's just superstition. Paul said, well, that's right, that would be superstition, but that's not all that's going on here. And so then he goes from sort of conceding that small point that's the only thing that they've considered, to going and say, now have you considered all of these other aspects? And so as you go through the rest of chapter 8, and Paul begins to kind of turn a corner from the concession of, yes, of course, there's no such thing as idols, but here's some reasons why you may want to stay away from the meat offered to idols. What are those reasons here in this particular chapter, Leonard? Leonard, your mic is muted. Sorry.
How about now?
There you go.
Okay. In building a little bit on what Matt said, I think we need to have a full understanding of how integrated the idol worship, the temples, all those activities were taking place in Corinth. As you early on talked about the atmosphere in Corinth and the fact that it was such a hub. And I think probably in addition to those, you see Paul talking to some of them, of the saints there, that were struggling with even participating because it was such a part of the culture. In all likelihood, as a Christian, if you said, I'm not going to participate in eating in the temples and things, they probably were going to be ostracized. They were not going to fit into that culture very well. So Paul steps through these arguments. As we've already pointed out, he makes the point that idols are nothing. We live through Christ and him alone. The second point is that the food neither condemns or commends us, as we have liberty to eat all things. But we're not required to eat it, and we're not any better or worse for it, determining whether we eat or not. He says, then, though, as we get down to verse 9, he says, beware lest somehow this liberty should be a stumbling block to those weaker saints. Saints that at one time were guilty of sacrificing to idols, and they may still struggle with those remnants of that idol worship. And he's going to talk more about that in the upcoming chapters, about this idea of participating with idols. And he says, then, if anyone thinks he is knowledge and he's seen eating in the temples, he's going to sin against a brother in Christ. If you look at verse 9, he said, and because of your knowledge shall the weak brother perish for whom Christ died. And obviously that rhetorical question, the answer is that we don't want to be participating in helping that brother perish. So Paul lays out those arguments pretty strong for us.
Yeah, and so they're focusing right here on is this going to affect me? And he says, well, it maybe not, but it might affect him. And so that's where he starts the argument against is it might affect him. Well, coming into chapter 9, he begins to build further in that direction, I would say, and sort of make the case for what it looks like to apply that thoughtfulness towards your brother. And it's really a little bit of a lengthy case that he makes here in chapter 9. And one of the things he does is he starts by laying out the foundations of the rights that he, the Apostle Paul, has. And of course, then he's going to talk about surrendering those rights. And he's going to talk even more about, what surrendering one's own rights and the causes one should surrender his rights for. But as he begins, that it's informative. Sometimes we look at certain parts of chapter 9 and we get some of these elements outside of their context. It is just informative. It's interesting to hear Paul say, what he had a right to do versus what he actually did. And so as you're just walking through there, Robert, what are some of the things Paul says that he had a right to?
Well, as you said, Paul emphasized that he is an apostle, and he has, he's seen Jesus. He has all the rights of the other apostles, and he specifically says in verse 4, do we have no right to eat and drink? He's talking about him and Apollos, or I'm sorry, Barnabas. But he says, one thing he says, don't they have a right to eat and drink? Another thing is, don't they have a right that he has a right to have a wife and be having her come around with him? And he definitely has a right that they have a right to refrain from working as far as supporting themselves. They have a right to be supported by those that they're preaching to. But he's going to go on to emphasize how much he has not exercised this right. And we know from our other study in Acts that he didn't exercise this right when he was among the Corinthians. He supported himself, and he emphasizes that he has these rights. He could be living from the gospel, could be living, expecting them to support him, and he lays out an argument from the Old Testament as well, and saying that he has these rights, but he has been refraining from exercising these rights.
Yeah, it's interesting to me that he, basically he's pointing to the other apostles. And one of the things I think is happening in Corinth is a gross inconsistency in what their expectations are. And I think you see that play out in various ways. We've already seen Paul talk about sort of like he would give up and he would be impoverished and he would be persecuted for their sakes. And then they would turn around and act like that's a lack of credentials on his part, when it's the very opposite, in fact. And so I think that they've done that a lot. And so Paul's pointing in other directions saying, look at Peter. Are you saying that he's got a right, but I don't? I'm no less of an apostle than he is. And so it's a weird sort of a thing, because he's about to, in the whole, it's not, but in the moment, you recognize that what he's fixing to do is say, put off all these rights, but he can't get there until he makes sure that they understand he has the rights to begin with. In other words, he's got to establish and say, let's be clear about what I could do. And so he just goes through, I can do all of these things that I did not do. And so he starts off with that case. But Matt, if he surrendered those rights, why does he bring them up now? And also, why not bring them up? I mean, somebody might conceivably say, well, if Paul had just asserted his rights while in Corinth, then we wouldn't be in this mess now. And so why not bring these rights up while he's in Corinth?
Well, Paul isn't claiming these rights now or when he's in Corinth, because that's not what he's trying to get. I mean, as Robert said, he's trying to get them to see that he does indeed have those rights. But he's pointing back to the topic at hand, that of eating meats sacrificed to idols. And he's trying to illustrate his point or his argument with an example, a personal example that he hopes that they'll understand. He has all of these rights, but because of the effect it would have on his brethren potentially, and his effectiveness in presenting the gospel to them, he's not going to use those rights. Interestingly enough, if you think of Paul and how he became an apostle, it's quite a bit different than what the other apostles did. The other apostles that they found Jesus, they were following Jesus. That wasn't how Paul came about. Paul there on the road to Damascus was converted, and Jesus said, I have a job for you, and you're going to go take this message to the Gentiles. And so as Paul mentions there, in the middle part of chapter 9, he says, I'm under obligation to do this. I was given a specific mission, almost as though he's saying, I'm not in it for the benefits of apostleship, of claiming all of these rights that I have access to, but I'm under obligation to do it. But the main point that I think he's trying to make is he is attempting to get the Corinthian brethren to see these liberties that I have. They're perfectly viable liberties that I could claim, but I'm not, because it would hinder the cause of the gospel. It would stop, it might prevent souls from being saved. And if you take advantage of the right that you have, that I can eat anything and God doesn't care, you could bring about the ruination of somebody else's soul. Are you going to take advantage of that right? And the answer, hopefully, that they come to the conclusion of is no, I'm not going to do that at all.
Yeah. And one thing to note about those rights, they're not, Paul has certain rights as a Roman citizen, and he asserts those on occasion. That's why we know that he has those rights. That's not even what he's talking about here. He's talking about as a Christian, he has these rights. So these aren't just legal rights. These are actually moral rights that he's saying that he has. And yet he would set those down. And as you say, he's hoping they'll come to the same conclusion. He's bringing them up not to assert them. He's bringing them up to show that he has not asserted them. And so I think that it just flies in the face of a lot of the sort of knee-jerk ways that we talk, because we do have lots of rights, legal rights, and it is a constant conversation in our society to talk about rights. Paul talks about them in a very opposite way of what we think of, to surrender them for the good of the gospel. Having said that, it doesn't mean that then that that Paul A, never asserted his rights, and that B, it's never even valuable to assert your rights. In fact, someone might read this and come away with the notion that, well, see, even though it's authorized to pay preachers, obviously from what Paul says here, it's better not to do that. Leonard, is that what we should take away from that?
No, obviously not. That it is a privilege to be able to, as Christians and as congregations, to support men that are preaching the gospel, yourself and other men that we support, for us to participate in that. And while Paul is, again, as Matt and you have said so very well, in this chapter, showing that he's willing to give up those rights. He states that again from the standpoint of something that could obviously be very personal to him, but he concludes it in verse 14 by saying, even so, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel. And Paul's own choice was so that his critics would have absolutely nothing to attack him on, refuse to accept that support. But Paul also says, woe is me if I do not preach the gospel. So Paul is an example for us in many ways here, but he's clearly stating also that while he did not take advantage of this right, it was something that certainly is acceptable and good and necessary for the spread of the gospel.
Yeah, I think as you look at Corinth, not just Corinth, but Thessalonica, I think as Paul does that, one of the things that he illustrates is he's doing that to reach non-Christians and immature Christians. And the idea is that as they go along, they ought to get to a more mature point where they are capable of dealing with that. You know, he doesn't want to look like he's doing it for the money. And once you have a mature relationship, you can move past that point. But I also think one of the things Paul's doing is bearing a burden, right? And so when he's working another job and making tents and then trying to do this as well, then what he's doing is bearing an additional burden. Now, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that, but it is going to keep him from being able to do all the work he could do. And so the ideal, obviously, is that a man is able to devote himself to that. But there may be circumstances, there was in Corinth, I've had those circumstances in my life where it's just better to not ask the brethren to take up that weight so that you can make more progress in that area. And I think that's what Paul's doing, while also, as you said, coming back and making emphatically clear the best thing is to support and give that opportunity. Well, Robert, he goes into the last part of the chapter here, talking about what modifications he was willing to make in his own life for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of the people he's preaching the gospel to. What sort of things, what sort of changes was he willing to make, and how does that connect to the Corinthians that he's writing to?
Well, we've just been discussing how much he has the rights, he has the liberties, but he chooses not to exercise them. And he says why. He says I made myself a servant to all that I might win the more. That's what he's done, and why. Because and he goes on to give more specific examples, that to the Jews I became as a Jew that I might win Jews, to those who are under the law as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law, those who are without the law as without the law. Although he clarifies that he's not talking about not being under law to Christ, but again he's talking about the Jews versus the Gentiles. And he says, to those who are weak I became as weak, that I might win the weak. He did all these things to consider them, to try to help save them, like you said, that I might by all means save some. We just talked about some examples that probably are covered by this. Just like, even though he knew he had the right to eat meat, whether it was sacrificed to idols or not, if he was around Gentile Christians, he was probably careful not to participate in or not to eat meat that was sacrificed to idols. When he was around Jews, he was probably careful not to eat things that would bother the Jews, and other things, not just as far as what they eat, but he considered the people he was talking to. Not that he ever did anything that was against the God's law to please them, but that he considered their feelings and their consciences in the way he conducted himself, so that they would be more open to receiving what he had to tell them, because that was his goal. His goal was to save them. The goal was to preach to them so that they could come to Christ. And so he definitely wasn't going to let any of his rights or his preferences be a hindrance to them. And he goes on to compare this to when he says those who are running in a race, if they're moderate in all things, they're temperate in all things. We're used to athletes denying themselves in order to accomplish something. And he's saying that he was doing the same thing. He denied himself some things he had every right to because it made him more effective. And that was what he cared about the most.
Yeah, I think as we just think about the radical adjustments that Paul would have to go to sort of fit in from one of those groups to another. And I think it's important. I think you noted the caveat. It's not ever that he put off God. And some people would take this to an extreme and say, Paul just did whatever the people around him were doing, with limitations, with very clear limitations, right? So it's not that I become without law towards Christ. It's not that he is willing to take on the law in a way to deny Christ, but he's willing to go as far as he can in order to gain access to people to be able to preach the gospel. And so that malleability, again, countercultural. I am who I am. I'm my own person. We're so very prideful sometimes in the way we talk about our unique identity. And for Christians, it should be an identity that is yielded up. Like I don't care if I have an identity outside of being identified with Christ. Like if that's the only thing, like people can't pinpoint something about me except that the one thing I know is that he's loyal to Christ. That's fine, right? If everything else is sort of ambiguous, as long as that's not ambiguous. And so I think that's a very countercultural point. And as you said, he had surrendered all this for their sakes. They need to be willing to surrender this for each other's sakes. Well, coming into chapter 10, we shift focus once again. We shift focus in argument, not in the point. We're still on the question of eating meats. We've kind of taken the long way round there in chapter 9 to really hammer home the points of chapter 8. But then chapter 10, we kind of change focus a little bit. And he starts by going back to the maybe central Old Testament story of the Exodus and make some connections there. What are the various connections that we see there, Matt, between the Israelites and the Corinthians?
Well, Stephen, I mean, you're exactly right. He's still honing in on the same argument or the same point, but he's making a new argument. And to make that argument, he's wanting to use an example, and he's wanting to use an example that will be meaningful to the Corinthians. And I find it kind of interesting, and maybe I've never really thought about it before till I was studying for this. In verse 1 there of chapter 10, he says, "For I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea." And then he goes on to complete the example. But he refers to the Israelites as the Corinthians' fathers. And you stop and think about the demographic background of the Corinthians. You wouldn't think they would be anywhere close to the Old Testament Israelite being their fathers. But yet that's what he calls them. But if you go over to a passage like Romans chapter 4, and you hear or you read a discussion rather on Abraham and where his righteousness came from and when it was counted to him for righteousness, we find that happened while he was uncircumcised, and that puts him in something in common with these Gentile Christians as well. And in Romans chapter 4 and verse 12 it says, "And the father of circumcision to those who are not only of the circumcision, but who also follow in the steps of faith of our father Abraham, which he had while uncircumcised." So Paul makes a point in using this example to connect the Corinthians back to Old Testament Israel. I also find it interesting that though these would have been Christians for relatively a short period of time, he expects them to know this story and have a connection to this story and count Old Testament Israel as their spiritual forefathers. So he's going to use Israel as an example, and he's made a connection that will hopefully mean something to the Corinthians. And I know the questions that follow will flesh out the specifics of that comparison, but in a nutshell, he says, don't get too confident or you'll be just like Israel. They were confident and they fell. And so he sets that up for them, and then he's going to lay it out in detail in the coming verses.
Yeah, and I really love the point that you highlighted there of the expectation to be able to use this and for them to be able to know what he's talking about, that they would have read not just the overarching story, but he goes and he hops around in that story. So we've got the crossing of the Red Sea, then we've got the manna, we've got the water, the drinking the water from the rock, and then we've got the violations and the judgments that come from those violations. And so we've just got a number of different comparisons. That's a broad requirement of knowledge, we might say. And so not just the surface knowledge. And so I appreciate that point. And then also, as you pointed out from Romans, Galatians, same thing. We're fellow heirs. That story is our story, right? And so whether we're Gentiles or Jews, it's our story. And we want that connection, both positive and negative. Because really, this is the negative comparison, right? This is not saying look back fondly at what happened to the Jews, but look back at the disaster. And so, along those lines, Leonard, what's the point? I mean, what's the point in bringing up Israel and comparing them to Corinth?
Yeah, I think he makes that point very clear in verse 12. When he says, therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. And obviously, it seems to me, with the points that have just been made about what those brethren in Corinth would have known, I think we can be confident that Paul would not have used this to make those points unless he was confident that they understood exactly what he was talking about. And so as we think back to chapter 8, where we've talked about that he's trying to help those Corinthian saints understand that they may not have it all figured out as they thought. And he's been building that through these 3 chapters. And he then goes to talk about, just like the children of Israel, who knew they were God's chosen people and banked on that for centuries, yet he said, we see that many of them died in the wilderness as they were just getting started because they did not have it all figured out. They were overconfident and as God's chosen people. And so even though there were so many things that they had observed of being baptized by Moses in the Red Sea, they were eating spiritual food and physical food that God provided them, yet they died in the wilderness due to unbelief and disobedience. And they were examples to those Corinthians of being overconfident, being puffed up, having knowledge that they thought they had that they really didn't. And I think Paul, even back where Robert was showing us what Paul was willing to give up, Paul even puts another stamp on that for them as he leads them into it, saying, thus I fight, disciplining my body, lest I should become disqualified or a castaway, as he uses in some versions there at the end of chapter 9.
Absolutely. The connection there, it is a fascinating one, but the connection is not just for us to be fascinated, it's for us to say, this could happen to you too. And I think as we study the Old Testament, as we open up the book of Exodus and we begin to be introduced to Israel, and we see them fall in chapter 32, and then we see them grumble time and again, even between the Red Sea and Mount Sinai. But then after, and the examples that he brings up here, I think very often we shake our heads and we just think these people are just, they're so deluded and so naive or childish, and just maybe any number of descriptions we might put on them. And we need to remember the point here. That's you, that lest you fall. If you look back and you don't see the same temptations and falterings that Israel had, and that's what these people are going through, we can get close and not be burned. He says, we've been through this story before. There's a whole history of this. Why do you think you're different? And what's particularly fascinating is as he walks down and makes those very specific: baptism, like your baptism; spiritual food, like your spiritual food. In other words, they say, well, their relationship to God was different. And Paul said, no. It's the same relationship. And I'm going to lay out all the elements of your relationship to God. Incidentally, it's kind of a sideways argument about baptism. I don't think Paul is teaching baptism here. He's actually assuming it, right? And he's saying, so he's walking through, what does it mean to be a Christian? I'm going to lay out all those elements, and I'm going to find them in Israel. And baptism is one of those elements. So he says, all of those elements about your relationship to God, they had them too, and they still fail. And so don't think that like you've got some special something that they didn't have, and that's going to keep you from falling. No, the whole that's the reason the story's there, is so that you might see that and not fall. Well, as he comes on down then, and continues to sort of make this case, Robert, how is the case in chapter 10 really differing from what we saw in chapters 8 and 9?
All right. Well, it's different in the focus. In 8 and 9, we were talking about considering other people, but here Paul reminds them, that number one, they need to consider their relationship to God, their personal relationship to God. He looks back at Israel and sees how the decisions they made, most importantly, with idolatry, led them to disaster. And so he sums up that in verse 14 with, therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. He wants to be certain that he's not saying that they don't take from him saying that idols are nothing, that this should be taken lightly, especially for those people who had previously been participating in idolatry. He points out the seriousness of this, that, he gives the example of when we're partaking of the Lord's Supper, that we're sharing in Christ's sacrifice, and that's a very important, serious thing. And that the Gentiles who sacrifice to idols are sharing in a sacrifice to demons. And that he says, I do not want you to have fellowship with demons. We must be careful that and again, especially he's talking to Christians in some cases who had previously been worshiping idols. And he's making it clear that they must be certain that they are not participating in that anymore. And they don't even have the appearance or take lightly following the patterns they used to have of, appearing to worship idols. Because, again, idolatry is still an offense to God. This is still, unlawful, and something that they must not have any part of. So, because we don't want to provoke the Lord, as he says.
Yeah. And so, it's interesting as you follow that argument down through, that now we're getting to the point of there's a real sin you could be committing. And it's not just an offense to your brother. It's you actually could go sit down in the midst of immorality and participate in immorality. And one of the things that I think is interesting is that table illustration. How could you sit at that table and this table? Well, that sounds very much like, you cannot serve God and mammon. You cannot be friends with the world. Friends with the world is enmity towards God. And so it's that idea of trying to maintain all of the old connections, trying to maintain that cultural connection and be a Christian. And I think we're coming to a point now at this point in the argument, whereas before it's more of it's a little bit more of a nebulous argument, a little bit more of an argument of, look, consider your brother, think about the guy next to you. And now it's think about your own heart. And so as he presses that, I think there's a lot of ways in which we could think about that as far as trying to stay culturally connected while also staying connected to God, and the difference between going on about our lives and living our lives in ways that are devoted towards God versus really being attached to the world that's sitting at the table, right? It's one thing if over there it was offered to idols, and then over here it's sold, right? And so there's that detachment. And that's what he says. If it's sold in the marketplace, okay, that's one thing, right? The closer its connection gets to the actual worship of the idols, the farther away you should get from it, right? And so here are people who it seems like they're willing to go all the way to the actual table where the idols are being worshiped and still say, all I'm doing is eating meat. You're sitting in the temple now. What do you mean you're not just eating meat anymore? You are there with the idolaters. And so that's a big difference from I am buying this thing over here. I think that we're going to run into that a lot today, that there's a big difference between we're buying a product and somebody says, don't you know the person that sold that to you is an idolater? Look, that's everywhere. I mean, products are going to be sold by idolaters. The difference is, am I sitting down with the idolaters as I enjoy my meal or whatever it is that I'm purchasing? And we're going to have to make some of those distinctions as we go along to make sure we maintain the appropriate distance, if you will. Well, coming down to the end, he gives a kind of a summation here. Give no offense, he says in verse 32, to either the Jews or the Greeks or to the church of God, just as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, so that they may be saved. It is a peculiar thing to read Paul saying, I please all men in all things, Matt. Not only because of things he said in this book, but in other places. I mean, he literally says, do not be men pleasers. And so what does this phrase here mean in this context?
Well, I think you're right. The context is the key. What we've looked at here in chapters 8 and chapter 9 about the idea of sacrificing your liberty, not claiming rights that you have in order to make your hearers more receptive to the gospel. And that's quite a contrast from the negative connotation of men pleasers, because men pleasers are just that. They're there to please men, and then that's their goal, that's their motivation, and in the end the goal is benefit to self, right? You're pleasing a man because you hope to get something from him. This question reminded me of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 6, when Jesus is saying, be careful how you give to the poor, be careful how you pray, be careful how you fast. If you're doing it to be seen of men, that's the reward that you'll have, that you're looking for. That's not the reward that Paul is looking for at all. Why Paul is willing to please men is because he hopes to bring more souls to the gospel. And the way in which Paul is attempting to please men is to get anything superficial out of the way. He's not going to change the truth of the gospel. He's not going to change the demands of the gospel. But if he can approach people in a way where they're not focusing on something personal that he does, some personal behavior of his, by all means, he'll throw that out the window, even if it's something that's an important part of his life. If it helps him to bring more souls to Christ, he's more than willing to do that. And that's the sense in which he will please men. In no way is he saying that I'm going to please men by sacrificing the content and truth and spirit of the gospel. In fact, what I'm doing is to let hearers be more receptive to the content and truth and spirit of the gospel.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. I really like that illustration that you use there of pleasing so as to get something from men versus pleasing so that I can give them something. There's very different motivations. And then also that idea, I appreciate that caveat. It's, am I compromising? What am I compromising in order to please? And what Paul is giving up, compromising, is his own personal aspects, nothing from the Lord. That doesn't get compromised. Paul says, I'll compromise me, not him. And so I think that's a great way to illustrate that. Leonard, as we're coming in here to a close, just looking back over these 3 chapters, we got one subject. And I mean, a very specific application, and yet there's just so much. I think it illustrates that what he said in verse 2, rather. You don't know what you think you know. And he builds all these arguments based on this one element of their lives. Kind of go back through and just sum up what are the takeaways about how we can think about something like this.
Well, I guess the question comes to my mind is, can we eat meat sacrificed to idols today? And under what circumstances could they eat meat in that particular New Testament times. And I think if we look at a couple other passages to solidify that, if you think about Acts 15 early in the church, where they had the Jerusalem Council, verse 28 through 29, they said, "For it seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us to lay upon you no greater burden than the necessary things, that you abstain from things offered to idols, from blood, from things strangled, from sexual immorality. If you keep yourself from these, you will do well, farewell." And so, of course, Paul and Barnabas carried that message back. And then on the other end of the New Testament, if we look at Revelation, to the church in Pergamos, John said, "But I have a few," or Christ said through him, "I have a few things against you, because you have there those who hold the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols, and to commit sexual immorality." And then in Revelation 2 and 20, to the church in Thyatira, we find, "Nevertheless, I have a few things against you, because you allow that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, to teach and seduce my servants to commit sexual immorality and eat things sacrificed to idols." And I think interesting, we find in these verses clearly the idea that we've discussed all the way through these in these 3 chapters, that and Robert pointed out very well, in the communion of the Lord's Supper, we are in fellowship, and if we do that with idols, then we are in fellowship with idols, as he used that example. I think also in these verses, we see tied very closely to the idea of eating things sacrificed to idols, the idea of sexual immorality. And we know from that time that in those temples in Corinth and other places, that those two things often were found hand in hand. And then we see Paul here in these chapters, and I think without having gone into the depth we've gone into, somebody might read that and just think, well, it's okay. And Paul's not saying it's okay. He is warning them over and over again in many ways to be careful about what they're doing. And I think, Stephen, maybe you mentioned earlier, they seemed like they had this idea of, how close can we get? How close can I stay to those things that we used to do and not be discounted by the Lord? And Paul's saying, you don't have the knowledge that you need to have, even though you understand it's truly an idol of something made by man, and it is not the true and living God. But as Paul says in chapter 8 and verse 7, not everyone, not all their brethren had that knowledge or that confidence. Thus he warns them in verses 9 and 10 of chapter 8 that their knowledge and desire to eat those meats in places of idol worship could be a stumbling block to the brethren and could be condemning of those brethren's souls, and obviously theirs as well. Then he goes into the chapter 9 about what he's willing to give up to help them understand that tone of sacrifice, them being willing to sacrifice for others. And then in chapter 10, as we talked about that downfall of Israel, but we see without a doubt, Paul is telling them that idols and their association with idolatry in verse 14 needs to be not something they get close to, but flee. The idea of getting away, running away, getting away from it as far as they could. So it was without a doubt a temptation to them. Paul's warning them about it. And so the question may come up, what is it that, were they allowed to eat? And Paul explained that in that last chapter, that if they were eating meat from the marketplace that was left over from sacrifices, they didn't need to ask those questions if they didn't have an issue with conscience about it. Or if they were at dinner, invited to dinner with someone, and that person didn't say anything about it, they did not need to do anything. They could eat that meat without any violation of their conscience. But then if that person raises that this was meat sacrificed to an idol and brings that connotation in that this may be something in that individual or that brethren's mind of being a religious aspect for him not to participate, down there in verse 27, because it could cause that brother's conscience. In fact, it creates a teaching moment for that brother. And so Paul's very careful to conclude that we don't want to violate a person's another brother, lead that other brother into temptation. And he reminds us that in verse 33 of chapter 10, when he says, just as I also please all men in all things, seeking my own profit, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, that they may be saved. And for each of us, even though we're not in chapter 11, but verse 1 of chapter 11, that probably should be with chapter 10, Paul says, imitate me just as I also imitate Christ. So I think one of the lessons for me, for us today, is we need to love our brethren. We need to be careful of doing things that would offend or hurt our brother's conscience, and always be acting in love for our brother, not thinking about ourselves first.
Yeah, absolutely. The the idea that our focus needs to be still more spiritually minded than it is. I mean, this is another carnal versus spiritual. How are you looking at this? And so it brings all of that to bear. I appreciate you guys. Appreciate everybody that is tuning in to this class, and we have a couple of more classes to look at next week. Our next class will be going into chapter 11. I agree with Leonard that the first verse probably goes better with this last section. But as we get there into chapter 11, we're taking the questions of divisions that have mostly been divisions caused by attitudes outside the assembly. Now we're coming into the assembly. And so for the next few chapters, 11 through 14, we're going to see what sorts of divisions were being caused there in the assembly. And again, what's the solution? And I think we're going to get to a central point that Leonard just hit on of the solution in chapter 13 that really spreads over the whole book as far as an attitude that will help so much with the fracturing that seems to be going on in Corinth. Thanks again for being with us. We hope that you'll join us for our next class, which we should have Tuesday evening or sometime Wednesday. Appreciate you tuning in and hope that these studies are helpful.